Daddy, he was in Mommy's belly with me, said the son, pointing to a homeless boy. His widowed father was paralyzed. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. David Mitchell adjusted his 7-year-old son's backpack straps as they walked down Fifth Avenue after Tommy's dentist appointment. The autumn wind carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and Tommy's small hand felt warm in his father's calloused palm. It had been 18 months since Sarah's funeral, and moments like these, simple father-son outings, still felt like navigating uncharted territory. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate?" Tommy asked, his brown eyes sparkling with the innocent hope that David could never resist. "Sure, buddy. There's a cafe just around the corner where Mom used to." David caught himself. Even now, mentioning Sarah felt like stepping on broken glass. They turned onto Maple Street, where the afternoon shadows grew longer between the old brownstones. David was reaching for his wallet when Tommy suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his small hands slipping from his father's grip. "Dad," Tommy whispered, his voice carrying a strange mixture of wonder and recognition. "Dad, look!" Following his son's gaze, David saw a small figure huddled in the doorway of an abandoned storefront. A boy, maybe Tommy's age, sat on a piece of cardboard with a torn blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His clothes were dirty and too big for his small frame, but what made David's breath catch in his throat was the boy's face. It was like looking at Tommy. Not similar, identical. The same chocolate brown eyes, the same slightly crooked smile, the same cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much you combed it. Even their posture was identical. Both boys tilted their heads the same way when they were curious or confused. "Oh my God!" David breathed, unable to move. The homeless boy looked up at them with those familiar eyes, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Tommy broke free from his father's stunned paralysis and walked slowly toward the boy, as if drawn by an invisible thread. "Hi," Tommy said softly. "I'm Tommy." "Alex," the other boy replied, his voice hoarse but unmistakably similar to Tommy's. David watched in shock as the two boys stared at each other like they were looking into mirrors. Then Tommy turned back to his father, his young face serious in a way that made David's heart race. "Dad," Tommy said, his voice carrying a certainty that chilled David to the bone. "He was in Mommy's belly with me." The words hit David like a physical blow. Sarah had never mentioned twins. Never mentioned another baby. The pregnancy had been difficult, yes, but she'd only ever talked about Tommy. Only ever prepared for one child. Only ever. "Tommy, what are you talking about?" David's voice came out strangled. "I remember him, Dad. In the dark, warm place. We used to push each other and play." Tommy looked back at Alex with pure recognition. "You remember too, don't you?" Alex nodded slowly, tears beginning to stream down his dirt-stained cheeks. "I always wondered where my brother was." David felt the world tilting off its axis. This wasn't possible. Sarah would have told him. Wouldn't she? But looking at these two identical boys who seemed to recognize each other with uncertainty that defied logic, David realized that everything he thought he knew about his wife, about Tommy's birth, about their life together, might have been built on lies. As he knelt down between the two boys, his hands shaking, David Mitchell had no idea that this moment would unravel secrets that had been buried for 7 years. Secrets that would threaten not just his understanding of the past, but the safety of both boys' futures. The question that would haunt him for the days to come had already formed in his mind. If Alex was really Tommy's twin brother, why had Sarah never told him? And how had his son ended up homeless on the streets of their own city? Behind them, a man in a dark coat who had been watching from across the street pulled out his phone and made a call. "He found him," the man said quietly. "Yes, sir. Both boys are together now." "What do you want me to do?" David's hands trembled as he fumbled with his car keys in the parking garage beneath his apartment building. Alex sat quietly in the back seat next to Tommy, wrapped in David's jacket, still clutching the worn teddy bear that had been his only possession on the street. The two boys hadn't stopped staring at each other during the entire drive home, occasionally whispering things that made them both smile, inside jokes from a shared memory that seemed impossible. "Mr. Mitchell," Alex said softly as they rode the elevator up to the 15th floor. "Why did my mommy give me away?" The question cut through David like a blade. He knelt down to Alex's eye level, searching those familiar brown eyes for answers he didn't have. "I don't know, son. But we're going to figure it out, okay? You're safe now." Inside the apartment, David's mind raced as he watched Tommy show Alex around their home. Every gesture, every expression, every laugh was identical. Even the way they both wrinkled their noses when they concentrated was exactly the same. This wasn't coincidence or wishful thinking. These boys were clearly twins. After settling Alex in Tommy's room with some of Tommy's clothes and toys, David retreated to his study and pulled out the metal box where he kept important documents. Sarah's medical records, birth certificates, insurance papers, everything from their 7 years of marriage. His hands shook as he spread the papers across his desk, searching for something, anything, that might explain what he'd witnessed today. The birth certificate showed only Tommy's name. The hospital records mentioned a single birth. But as David dug deeper, he found something that made his blood run cold, a receipt from a private medical practice he didn't recognize, dated 2 weeks after Tommy's birth. The amount was substantial, $15,000. In the memo line, Sarah had written, "Final payment, services rendered." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. They shouldn't have found each other. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. Keep the boy quiet, or others will get hurt. David's blood turned to ice. Someone was watching them. Someone knew about Alex, about the twins, about whatever Sarah had hidden from him. He quickly deleted the text and moved to the window, scanning the street below for anything suspicious. That's when he noticed the same dark sedan that had been parked across from the coffee shop earlier, now sitting under the streetlight outside his building. He closed the blinds and double-checked all the locks, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was threatening them? And what had Sarah done that required $15,000 in payment just after giving birth? From Tommy's room, he could hear both boys giggling together, and the sound broke his heart. Whatever secrets Sarah had kept, whatever danger they might be in, these two children deserved to know the truth about who they were. But first, he had to keep them safe. The next morning, David called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. He couldn't leave the boys alone, not with that threatening text message burning in his memory. While Tommy and Alex built elaborate Lego fortresses in the living room, working together with an intuitive synchronization that amazed him, David continued his search through Sarah's belongings. In the back of her closet, behind boxes of winter clothes, he found something he'd never seen before, a small leather journal with a lock. His hands shook as he broke the tiny clasp with a screwdriver. The first entry was dated 8 months into Sarah's pregnancy. "The doctor says they're both healthy, but I can only keep one." David would never understand. "He thinks we're not ready for even one child, let alone 2. I see how he struggles with money, how he works double shifts just to make ends meet. 2 babies would destroy us financially, emotionally. I have to make an impossible choice." David's vision blurred as he read entry after entry detailing Sarah's secret pregnancy with twins. She had been seeing Dr. Elizabeth Hartman at a private clinic, paying cash to keep the visits off their insurance records. The entries painted a picture of a woman tortured by an impossible decision. "I met the Harrison family today. They've been trying to have children for years. They can give one of my babies everything I can't: private schools, college funds, a mother who doesn't have to work 2 jobs. But how do you choose which child to keep? How do you decide which baby gets the privileged life and which one stays with parents who can barely afford rent?" The journal entries stopped abruptly 2 weeks before the boy's birth, but David found something else tucked between the pages: a business card for Hartman Adoption Services, and a receipt for $50,000 with the notation: "Final placement fee, confidential arrangement." But if the Harrisons had paid $50,000 to adopt Alex, how had he ended up homeless on the street? David's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Detective Sarah Chen with the Metro Police Department. We need to talk about the boy you took in yesterday. Can you come down to the station? Is Alex in trouble? He's just a child, sir. The child you found isn't just homeless. He's been missing for 3 years. And the family that reported him missing, they've been looking for him ever since he disappeared from his foster home. David's world tilted again. Foster home? But he was adopted by the Harrisons, sir. I think you'd better come in. There are things about this case that you need to know. As David hung up the phone, he realized that Sarah's journal had only revealed the tip of an iceberg. The real question wasn't why Sarah had given Alex away. It was what had happened to him after the adoption, and why someone was now threatening David's family to keep the boys apart from the living room. He heard Tommy say, "Alex, do you remember the bad people who took you away from your nice house?" "I try not to think about them," Alex replied quietly. "But they said if I ever found my brother, something terrible would happen." David felt his heart stop. Whatever web of lies and secrets Sarah had been caught in, it was far from over. And now, both boys were in danger. Detective Chen's office smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and graying temples, but her handshake was firm as she greeted David. Alex sat beside him, clutching Tommy's hand as if his life depended on it. David had refused to leave him at home. Whoever had sent that threatening text might try to take him. "Mr. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear," Detective Chen began, pulling out a thick file. "The boy you know as Alex was reported missing 3 years ago by his adoptive parents, Janet and Robert Harrison. But his birth name isn't Alex, it's Michael Harrison." David felt the room spin. "Michael? But he said his name was Alex." "Children sometimes change their names when they're trying to hide," the detective explained gently. "The Harrisons are good people, Mr. Mitchell. They've never stopped looking for him. They hired private investigators, worked with multiple police departments, posted his picture everywhere. They're devastated that he's been living on the streets." Michael, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The bad man told me never to use that name again. He said if I told anyone who I really was, he'd hurt my new mommy and daddy." Detective Chen leaned forward. "What bad man, sweetheart? Can you tell us about him?" "He came to our house when I was sleeping. He had a gun and he told Mommy Janet that they had to give me back or something terrible would happen to everyone. Mommy was crying and Daddy was angry, but the bad man said it wasn't their choice anymore." David's blood ran cold. "Someone forced the Harrisons to give up their son?" "That's what we believe," Detective Chen confirmed. "The Harrisons reported a break-in that night, but they claimed nothing was stolen. They told us Michael had run away, but we always suspected there was more to the story. They were too scared to tell us the truth." She opened another file and showed David a photograph of a man in his 50s with cold gray eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "We think this man is responsible, Vincent Carlucci. He runs what appears to be a legitimate adoption agency, but we suspect he's involved in something much darker. Child trafficking, illegal adoptions, possibly worse." David stared at the photograph, and a memory surfaced. Sarah coming home late one night during her pregnancy, nervous and jumpy, claiming she'd had car trouble. When he'd offered to take her car to the mechanic, she'd insisted it was fine, that she'd already had it taken care of by a friend. "Detective, I think my wife might have been involved with this man. I found evidence that she received $50,000 around the time the boys were born." Detective Chen's expression darkened. "Mr. Mitchell, if your wife was working with Carlucci, then both boys are in serious danger. He doesn't just arrange illegal adoptions, he sells children to the highest bidder. Sometimes to people who don't have good intentions." Michael spoke up in a small voice. "The bad man said I was special because I had a brother. He said people would pay lots of money for boys who looked exactly the same." The words hit David like a physical blow. Twins were valuable in the trafficking world, double the profit, perfect for buyers who wanted matching children for unspeakable purposes. "We need to put both boys in protective custody immediately," Detective Chen said. "Carlucci has resources, connections. If he knows they're together again, David's phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. The detective is pretty, but not very smart. Building has 4 exits. Boys should stay close to Daddy if they want to stay safe. David showed the text to Detective Chin, whose face went pale. He's here. In the building. She was already reaching for her radio when the lights went out. In the darkness, David heard Michael whisper to Tommy. I told you the bad people would find us again. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows in the hallway as Detective Chin led David and the boys through the maze of corridors in the police station. Her hand rested on her weapon, and she spoke in quick, hushed tones into her radio, calling for backup units and asking for status reports from building security. Elevators out, she muttered, pushing open the door to the stairwell. We'll have to go down the back way. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the narrow concrete stairs as they descended. David carried Alex, Michael, while Tommy held tight to his father's jacket. The boys hadn't said a word since the lights went out, but David could feel their terror. On the 3rd-floor landing, Detective Chin suddenly stopped, holding up her hand for silence. Through the metal door, they could hear voices, men speaking in low, urgent tones. Saw them go up to Chen's office. Boss wants them alive, but if they resist, both kids, and eliminate any witnesses. Detective Chen's face was grim as she motioned for them to continue down. But when they reached the 2nd floor, she stopped again. More voices coming from below. They were trapped. There's a maintenance room on this floor, she whispered. We can hide there until backup arrives. But as they opened the door to the 2nd-floor corridor, a man in a dark suit was waiting for them. He had the same cold gray eyes from the photograph Detective Chin had shown David, and the scar running down his face made him look even more menacing in person. Vincent Carlucci, Detective Chin said, her gun drawn. You're under arrest. Carlucci smiled, and David noticed he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both armed. Detective Chin, always so naive. You really think a few patrol cops are going to stop this? I own half the judges in this city, and the other half owe me favors. The boys aren't going anywhere with you, David said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. Oh, but they are. You see, Mr. Mitchell, these children represent a very specific investment. 7 years ago, your wife borrowed a considerable sum of money from my organization. She was supposed to deliver both boys to my clients, but she got sentimental and kept one. That debt, with interest, now stands at $200,000. Michael whispered to Tommy. He's the bad man I told you about. Sarah paid you $15,000. I saw the receipt, David said. Carlucci laughed. That was just the down payment. She died before she could fulfill her contract. Now the debt passes to you. Of course, you could never afford to pay it, so the boys will have to settle the account instead. Detective Chin stepped forward. Over my dead body. That can be arranged, Carlucci said casually. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Detective Chin lunged forward, shouting for David to run. Gunshots echoed in the hallway. David grabbed both boys and sprinted back toward the stairwell, Chen's anguished cry following them. They burst through the stairwell door and raced upward, taking the steps 3 at a time. Behind them, David could hear heavy footsteps and angry voices. They reached the roof access, and David shouldered through the heavy metal door into the cold evening air. The roof of the police station overlooked the city center. 15 floors below, police cars were arriving with sirens wailing, their red and blue lights painting the buildings in shifting colors. But David knew backup wouldn't reach them in time. Dad, I'm scared, Tommy said. Me too, Michael added, and David realized this was the first time the boy had called him Dad. Listen to me, both of you, David said, kneeling between them as footsteps pounded up the stairs behind them. No matter what happens, you stay together. You're brothers, and brothers protect each other. Do you understand? Both boys nodded, and David felt his heart breaking. These 2 children, separated by lies and greed, had found each other against impossible odds. He wouldn't let anyone tear them apart again. The roof door exploded open, and Carlucci emerged with his men, guns drawn. But before they could reach the boys, David heard something that made him smile: the sound of helicopter rotors overhead, and the voice of a police negotiator echoing from a loudspeaker below. "Vincent Carlucci, you are surrounded. Release the hostages and come out with your hands up." Carlucci's face twisted with rage as he realized his escape routes had been cut off. But his expression changed to something even more dangerous when he looked at David and the boys. "If I can't have them," he said, raising his gun, "then nobody can." The helicopter's spotlight bathed the rooftop in harsh white light as Carlucci and his men found themselves surrounded by police sharpshooters positioned on neighboring buildings. Detective Chin emerged from the stairwell, wounded but alive, her weapon trained on Carlucci while blood seeped through her shirt sleeve. "It's over, Vincent," she called out. "FBI's here too. Your friends in the courthouse can help you now." Carlucci kept his gun pointed at David and the boys, but David could see the calculation in the man's eyes. He was looking for a way out, an angle to escape. That's when Michael stepped forward, his small voice cutting through the tension. "You killed my mommy, didn't you?" he said to Carlucci. "My real mommy, Sarah. Tommy's mommy." Carlucci's eyes narrowed. "Smart kid. Too smart for his own good." David felt his world collapse. "What is he talking about?" "Sarah died in a car accident. Your wife got cold feet," Carlucci snarled. 7 years ago. She was supposed to hand over both boys to my clients. Instead, she tried to back out of the deal, threatened to go to the police. Said she'd made a mistake, that she couldn't live with what she'd done. The helicopter circled overhead, its rotors drowning out the sound of David's heartbeat pounding in his ears. Detective Chim was motioning for backup, but David barely noticed. The truth was unfolding in front of him like a nightmare. "Sarah came to me 2 years ago," Carlucci continued, "begging to buy back the boy she'd given away. Said she'd saved enough money to pay off the debt. I told her the boy was already sold, but she wouldn't accept it. She threatened to expose my entire operation." Michael looked up at David with those familiar brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, and said quietly, "She tried to save me, didn't she?" "She did," Carlucci admitted. "But some mistakes can't be undone. That car accident your wife died in. Let's just say her brakes failed at a very convenient time." David felt rage building in his chest like a physical force. Sarah hadn't died randomly, she'd been murdered for trying to save the son she'd given away. The woman he'd loved, the mother of his children, had been killed because she tried to make things right. "You bastard," David whispered. "Daddy, don't," Tommy said, grabbing David's arm. "The bad man wants you to be angry. That's how he wins." Out of the mouths of babes. David looked down at his son, at both his sons, and realized that their innocent wisdom was right. Carlucci fed on fear and rage. But these boys had survived 3 years of separation, street life, and unimaginable trauma, and they'd still found their way back to each other. They were stronger than any of the adults in this situation. Detective Chen's voice cut through the night air. "Vincent Carlucci, you're wanted in connection with 17 counts of child trafficking, 12 counts of kidnapping, and now 2 counts of murder. There's nowhere to run." "There's always somewhere to run," Carlucci replied, but David could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. That's when the boys did something that surprised everyone on the rooftop. They walked forward together, hand in hand, and stood between Carlucci and the edge of the building. Not as victims, but as witnesses. "You can't hurt us anymore," Michael said, his voice clear and strong. "Everyone can see you now. Everyone knows what you did. We're not scared of you," Tommy added. "We found each other, and that's all that matters." Carlucci looked down at the 2 boys, identical faces that should have been part of his twisted business empire, and David saw something flicker in the man's cold eyes. Recognition, perhaps, that he'd already lost the thing that mattered most: control. The sound of boots on the rooftop announced the arrival of FBI tactical units, and Carlucci's remaining men dropped their weapons and raised their hands. But Carlucci himself backed toward the edge of the building, his gun still in his hand. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at David. "There are others in my organization, people who know about the boys. You'll never be safe. Maybe not, David replied, putting his arms around both boys. But we'll be together. And sometimes that's enough. As the FBI agents moved in to arrest Carlucci, David realized that despite everything they'd been through, the lies, the danger, the loss, something miraculous had emerged. His family was whole again. Sarah's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her twin sons were together, safe, and loved. But even as the immediate danger passed, David knew their story was far from over. There were still questions to answer, legal battles to fight, and healing to be done. Most importantly, there was a lifetime of brotherhood for Tommy and Michael to discover. The truth had set them free, but freedom, David was learning, was just the beginning. 3 days after the rooftop confrontation, David sat in a federal safe house watching his sons play chess at the kitchen table. The modest 2-bedroom house in suburban Virginia felt like a fortress compared to the chaos they'd escaped, but the FBI agents stationed outside served as a constant reminder that their ordeal wasn't over. Agent Maria Rodriguez, a stern woman in her 40s with kind eyes, spread a collection of photographs across the dining room table. These are the people we've identified as part of Carlucci's network, she explained to David. Even with him in custody, there are others who might try to finish what he started. David studied the faces, men and women who looked like ordinary people, the kind you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Teachers, businesspeople, even a pediatrician. How many children? He asked. Over the past 5 years? We estimate at least 60 missing children passed through his organization. Your boys were part of a larger operation that we're still unraveling. Agent Rodriguez's voice was professional, but David could hear the weight of those numbers in her words. From the kitchen, Michael called out, "Dad, Tommy's cheating at chess." "I am not," Tommy protested. "You just don't like losing." David smiled despite everything. In just 3 days, the boys had fallen into the easy rhythm of brotherhood as if they'd never been separated. They finished each other's sentences, shared inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, and had developed their own secret language of looks and gestures. Watching them together, David could almost forget the nightmare they'd lived through. But late at night, when the boys were asleep, David would hear Michael whimpering in his dreams, calling out for Mommy Janet, and apologizing for something that wasn't his fault. And Tommy had started having nightmares too, his subconscious processing the trauma of nearly losing his newly found brother. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the same doctor who had helped Sarah with the secret twin pregnancy, arrived that afternoon for what Agent Rodriguez called a consultation. David recognized her immediately from Sarah's journal, and his first instinct was to ask her to leave. But the doctor's first words stopped him cold. "Mr. Mitchell, I've come to tell you the truth about what your wife was trying to do. The whole truth." She was a small woman with silver hair and tired eyes, and when she sat down across from David, he could see she was carrying a burden that had aged her beyond her years. 7 years ago, Sarah came to me desperate and afraid. She was pregnant with twins, but she and you were barely making ends meet. She'd heard about families who paid good money for healthy babies, and she thought she could solve her financial problems by giving one child away. David's jaw tightened. She could have talked to me. We could have figured something out. She was protecting you. Dr. Hartman continued. You see, Sarah had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition during her pregnancy. The stress of carrying twins was putting enormous strain on her system. I told her she might not survive the birth, and if she did, she probably wouldn't live long enough to see the children grow up. The room seemed to tilt around David. What are you saying? Your wife knew she was dying, Mr. Mitchell. She wanted to make sure at least one of her sons would have a secure future with parents who could provide everything she couldn't. The Harrisons seemed perfect, wealthy, stable, desperate for a child. She never intended for either boy to end up with someone like Carlucci. Michael appeared in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. She was sick? My birth mommy was sick? Dr. Hartman's voice grew gentle. She loved both of you boys more than anything in the world. Everything she did because she wanted you to be safe and happy. But she lived for 7 more years. David said, confusion mixing with grief. She didn't die in childbirth. No, she didn't. The experimental treatment I connected her with bought her time, precious years with Tommy that she never expected to have. But when she learned that Michael had disappeared from his adoptive family, that he was missing and possibly in danger, the stress triggered another cardiac episode. She came to me 6 months before she died, begging for help to find him. Tommy joined his brother in the doorway, both boys listening intently. Did she find him? Tommy asked. She tried. She hired private investigators, worked with Detective Chin, even contacted Carlucci directly when she learned he might be involved. But by then, Michael had already disappeared from the system entirely. Dr. Hartman's eyes filled with tears. Your mother died believing she had failed both of you. David felt a wave of grief and admiration wash over him. Sarah hadn't been the woman he thought he'd married. She'd been stronger, more selfless, and more desperate than he'd ever imagined. She'd made impossible choices trying to protect her family, and in the end, those choices had cost her everything. There's something else. Dr. Hartman continued. Sarah left something for the boys. She gave it to me before she died, with instructions to give it to them only if they were ever reunited. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden box with both boys' names carved into the lid. Inside were 2 identical lockets, each containing a picture of Sarah holding both babies together in the hospital. She wanted you to know, Dr. Hartman said, handing the lockets to Tommy and Michael, that even when you were apart, you were always together in her heart. As the boys examined the lockets, David realized that Sarah's story was finally complete. But Agent Rodriguez's radio crackled to life, interrupting the moment of peace. Rodriguez here. What? Are you sure? Understood. We're moving now. She turned to David, her face grim. Carlucci escaped federal custody during a prisoner transport an hour ago. We need to move the family to a more secure location immediately. The second safe house was a farmhouse in rural Maryland, surrounded by 20 acres of cornfields and protected by a team of federal marshals. David watched through the kitchen window as Tommy and Michael played catch in the backyard, their laughter carrying across the autumn air. It had been a week since Carlucci's escape, and the boys seemed to be adapting better to their situation than the adults. Any word on Carlucci's whereabouts? David asked Marshal James McKinnon, a tall man with graying temples who'd been assigned as their primary protection detail. He's smart, and he's connected, McKinnon replied. But he's also desperate, which makes him dangerous. Men like Carlucci don't just disappear, they go to ground, regroup, and strike back when you least expect it. David's phone rang, a secure line that only Agent Rodriguez and a few other federal personnel had access to. But when he answered, the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. Hello, David? Miss me? Carlucci. Somehow, he'd gotten access to David's protected phone number. How did you? I told you, I have friends everywhere. The question now is, how far are you willing to go to keep those boys safe? McKinnon was already on his radio, calling for a trace on the call, but David knew it would be useless. Carlucci was too experienced to stay on the line long enough to be tracked. What do you want? David asked. Simple. Bring both boys to the old textile mill on Route 40 in Baltimore. Midnight tomorrow. Come alone, no federal agents, no police backup. In exchange, I'll give you something your wife would have wanted. Sarah is dead. You killed her. But her parents aren't. Yes, David, Sarah's mother and father are very much alive, and they'd been looking for their grandsons for 7 years. They hired me to find the boys originally, before things got complicated. David felt the world shift beneath his feet. Sarah had told him her parents were dead, killed in a car accident when she was in college. Another lie, another secret in a marriage built on foundations of sand. You're lying. Margaret and Thomas Brennan for 12 Elm Street, Portland, Oregon. They'd been sending birthday cards to a post office box for 7 years, hoping their daughter might still be alive to read them. They don't know she's dead, David. They don't know their grandsons exist. But they could, if you bring me the boys. The line went dead, leaving David staring at the phone in his trembling hand. Marshal McKinnon was already calling in the threat, mobilizing additional security, preparing to relocate them again. But David wasn't listening. His mind was reeling with the possibility that Tommy and Michael had living grandparents who didn't even know they existed. That evening, after the boys were asleep, David made a decision that he knew would anger every federal agent protecting them. He called the number Carlucci had given him, not to agree to the meeting, but to verify if what the man had said was true. "Brennan residence," answered a woman's voice that sounded remarkably like Sarah's. "Mrs. Brennan? This is going to sound strange, but I'm calling about your daughter Sarah." There was a long pause then. "Sarah? Oh my God, is she alive? We haven't heard from her in 8 years. She just disappeared one day, and we've been searching ever since." David's heart broke all over again. Sarah hadn't just lied to him, she'd cut herself off from her entire family to protect some secret that had eventually killed her. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Sarah passed away 2 years ago. But she had children. Twin boys. Your grandsons." The sound of sobbing came through the phone, followed by a man's voice. "Who is this? How do you know about our daughter?" "I was her husband. And right now, your grandsons are in danger because of choices Sarah made before they were born. But they're safe, and they're together, and they need to know they have family who loves them." David spent the next hour on the phone with Margaret and Thomas Brennan, piecing together Sarah's life before he'd met her. She'd been in trouble with the wrong people, involved in something she never fully explained to her parents. When she disappeared, they'd assumed the worst, that she'd been killed or taken. They'd never stopped looking for her. "Bring the boys to us," Margaret pleaded. "We'll protect them. We have resources, security. Please, they're all we have left of our daughter." But even as David considered the possibility, he knew it wasn't that simple. Carlucci knew about the Brennans, which meant he could use them as leverage. And taking the boys across the country would mean leaving federal protection, exposing them to even greater danger. After hanging up the phone, David walked out to the porch where Marshal McKinnon was doing his evening security check. "Marshal, if I asked you to help me get my boys to their grandparents in Oregon, what would you say?" McKinnon studied David's face in the dim porch light. "I'd say you're thinking like a father instead of thinking like a target. Carlucci is counting on that. But what if staying here is more dangerous than running? What if the only way to truly protect them is to get them as far away from Carlucci's reach as possible? Then I'd say you'd better have a plan that doesn't involve trusting anyone, including me." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. David realized that McKinnon was right. After 7 years of lies and betrayals, the only person he could truly trust was himself. But that also meant the hardest decision was yet to come. The secure video call with Margaret and Thomas Brennan revealed 2 people in their 70s who shared Sarah's eyes and gentle manner. Margaret couldn't stop crying as she looked at Tommy and Michael through the computer screen, while Thomas kept asking them questions about their favorite foods, sports, and subjects in school, desperate to learn everything about the grandsons he'd never known existed. "You look just like your mother when she was your age," Margaret told the boys, her voice shaking with emotion. She had the same mischievous smile, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. "Did she like chess?" Michael asked. "Tommy and I love chess. She was the Oregon State champion 3 years in a row," Thomas said proudly. "I still have all her trophies in her old room." David watched the reunion through tears, but part of his mind remained focused on the immediate danger. Carlucci was still out there, still hunting them, and David needed to know everything about Sarah's past if he was going to protect his sons. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," he said gently, "I need you to tell me why Sarah cut contact with you. What was she involved in before she disappeared?" The elderly couple exchanged a look that David recognized, the same expression Sarah used to get when she was hiding something important. "Sarah was always a fighter," Thomas began carefully. "Even as a child, she couldn't stand to see injustice. In college, she got involved with a group that was investigating corruption in the adoption system." "What kind of corruption?" David pressed. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Children were being taken from good families and sold to people who wanted them for the wrong reasons. Sarah and her friends were gathering evidence, building cases against the people responsible. David felt his stomach drop. People like Vincent Carlucci? We don't know that name, Thomas said, but Sarah told us she'd uncovered something big, something that went all the way to the top of the state government. Then one day, she called us terrified, saying she had to disappear or people would get hurt. We begged her to come home, to let us help, but she said the only way to keep us safe was to stay away. She was protecting you, David realized. Just like she was protecting me and the boys. There's something else, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. 3 months ago, a man came to our house asking questions about Sarah. He said he represented a law firm that was settling her estate, but something felt wrong about him. David's blood ran cold. Can you describe him? Gray eyes, scar on his face, Thomas said. He seemed very interested in whether Sarah had ever had children, whether we'd heard from any grandchildren. Carlucci had been watching the Brennans, gathering information about Sarah's family for months. David realized this wasn't just about recovering the boys for his trafficking operation. This was personal revenge against a woman who had tried to expose his crimes years before she'd even become involved with him. Marshal McKinnon, who had been listening to the conversation, leaned forward. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, you're in danger. We need to arrange federal protection for you immediately. But Thomas shook his head. We're not running anymore. We lost our daughter because we couldn't protect her from these people. We won't lose our grandsons the same way. What are you saying? David asked. Margaret's voice was stronger now, filled with a determination that reminded David of Sarah. We're saying it's time to stop running and start fighting back. We still have contacts from Sarah's old investigation, people who've been waiting 7 years for another chance to take down this organization. You're talking about vigilante justice, Marshal McKinnon warned. That's not how the federal system works. The federal system has been trying to catch these people for decades, Thomas replied. Maybe it's time for a different approach. Over the next hour, the Brennans revealed a network of former law enforcement officers, investigative journalists, and child welfare advocates who had been quietly tracking child trafficking operations across the Pacific Northwest. They'd been waiting for someone with inside knowledge of Carlucci's organization to come forward. Sarah gathered evidence before she disappeared, Margaret explained. She hid it somewhere safe, along with the names of everyone involved. If we could find it, we could destroy Carlucci's entire network, David finished. Tommy looked up from the chess game he'd been playing with Michael during the adults' conversation. Dad, are Grandma and Grandpa going to help us stop the bad man? I think they're going to try, son. Good, Michael said quietly. I want him to go away forever. As the video call ended, David realized they were at a crossroads. They could continue hiding under federal protection, always looking over their shoulders, never knowing when Carlucci might find them. Or they could take the fight directly to him, using Sarah's hidden evidence to end his operation once and for all. But that would mean putting the boys in even greater danger, at least temporarily. It would mean trusting people David had never met based on the word of grandparents who had been strangers until a few hours ago. Marshal McKinnon was already on his radio, arranging protection for the Brennans and discussing the possibility of moving David and the boys to Oregon. But David was thinking about something else, Carlucci's deadline. Midnight tomorrow at the textile mill. What if, instead of running, they used that meeting as an opportunity to end this once and for all? The abandoned textile mill squatted like a concrete beast beside the polluted waters of Baltimore's inner harbor. David crouched behind a rusted shipping container, watching the building through night vision binoculars while FBI agents took their positions around the perimeter. Despite Carlucci's demand that he come alone, there was no way Marshal McKinnon was letting David walk into what was obviously a trap without backup. Remember, your job is to keep him talking long enough for us to move in. Agent Rodriguez's voice crackled through the earpiece hidden in David's collar. Don't try to be a hero. But David wasn't thinking about heroics. In his jacket pocket was a flash drive containing copies of every document from Sarah's journal, every photograph from Dr. Hartman's files, and every piece of evidence the FBI had gathered about Carlucci's operation. The plan was simple. If Carlucci wanted to trade information about Sarah's parents for the boys, David would offer him something better, evidence that could implicate dozens of other people in the trafficking ring, people who would happily sacrifice Carlucci to save themselves. The boys were safely hidden in a hotel room 50 miles away, guarded by a team of federal marshals and connected by video link to Margaret and Thomas Brennan in Oregon. Whatever happened tonight, Tommy and Michael would know their grandparents were watching over them. At 11:58 p.m., a black sedan pulled up to the mill's loading dock. Carlucci emerged alone, but David could see other shadows moving inside the building. The man was taking no chances. David walked slowly across the empty lot, his hands visible and his heart pounding. When he was 20 feet away from Carlucci, he stopped. "Where are the boys?" Carlucci called out. "Safe." "Where are Sarah's parents?" Carlucci smiled and pulled out his phone, showing David a live video feed of an elderly couple tied to chairs in what looked like a warehouse. Margaret and Thomas Brennan were clearly terrified but alive. "They're comfortable, for now. But their safety depends on your cooperation." David felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I brought you something better than the boys. Information that will make you rich and keep you out of prison." "I'm listening." David pulled out the flash drive. "Everything. Client lists, financial records, government contacts who've been protecting your operation. Sarah documented it all before she died, and she hid it where you'd never think to look." Carlucci's eyes narrowed. "You're lying. We searched her house, her car, her workplace. There was nothing. Because she was smarter than you gave her credit for. She knew you'd kill her eventually, so she made sure her evidence would surface after her death. The only reason it hasn't come out yet is because she wanted to protect her sons first." "Show me." David held up the flash drive, but didn't move closer. "First, let the Brennans go. Then we can make a deal that benefits everyone." "You're not in a position to negotiate," Carlucci said, but David could see uncertainty in the man's eyes. "Actually, I am. Because right now, every federal agency in the country is looking for you. But with this evidence, I can give them something better, your entire organization, wrapped up with a bow. In exchange, maybe you disappear to a country that doesn't extradite. Maybe you get to live instead of spending the rest of your life in Supermax prison." Carlucci was quiet for a long moment, calculating odds and possibilities. Finally, he nodded to someone David couldn't see, and spoke into his phone. "Release them." On the phone screen, David watched as Margaret and Thomas Brennan were untied and escorted out of the warehouse. A few seconds later, Agent Rodriguez's voice confirmed through his earpiece that federal agents had taken the elderly couple into protective custody. "No," Carlucci said. "The flash drive." David tossed it across the space between them, and Carlucci caught it with one hand while keeping his gun trained on David with the other. As the man plugged the drive into his phone, David saw his expression change from suspicion to greed to horror. "This is... How did she get access to these files? She was more connected than you knew. The question is, what are you going to do with that information?" But as Carlucci scrolled through the files, David could see realization dawning on the man's face. This wasn't just evidence against Carlucci's organization, it was evidence against Carlucci himself, documented proof of every crime he'd committed over the past decade. "You played me," Carlucci said quietly, his voice filled with admiration and rage. "This isn't a bargaining chip. This is a death warrant. Only if it gets into the wrong hands," David replied. "But if you disappear tonight, if you never come near my family again, that evidence stays buried with Sarah. And if I refuse? Then by morning, every law enforcement agency in the world will have copies." Carlucci raised his gun, and David closed his eyes, thinking of Tommy and Michael watching safely from their hotel room. At least his sons would grow up knowing their father had tried to protect them. The gunshot echoed across the empty lot, but David felt no pain. Opening his eyes, he saw Carlucci falling to the ground, clutching his shoulder as FBI tactical teams swarmed the building from every direction. Target down! Agent Rodriguez's voice called out. Suspect in custody. As federal agents surrounded Carlucci and read him his rights, David realized that Sarah's long game had finally played out. The evidence on that flash drive would indeed destroy the trafficking network, but not by making deals with criminals. By giving law enforcement everything they needed to end it once and for all. Walking away from the textile mill as dawn broke over Baltimore's skyline, David knew that Tommy and Michael were finally, truly safe. But more than that, they were free to build the life that Sarah had always dreamed they could have. 6 months later, David stood in the backyard of their new house in Portland, Oregon, watching Tommy and Michael play catch with their grandfather while Margaret tended to her rose garden. The Federal Witness Protection Program had relocated them across the country, giving them new identities and a fresh start in a place where Carlucci's network could never reach them. The trial had made national headlines. Vincent Carlucci and 37 members of his organization were convicted on charges ranging from child trafficking to murder. Sarah's evidence, hidden all those years in a safety deposit box registered under her maiden name, had provided the breakthrough that law enforcement had been seeking for over a decade. More than 200 missing children were recovered and reunited with their families. "Dad, watch this!" Tommy called out, throwing a perfect spiral to Michael, who caught it despite being nearly tackled by Thomas's enthusiastic golden retriever. "Not bad for a couple of city boys," David laughed, settling into a lawn chair beside Margaret. "They're adjusting well," she said, her voice warm with the contentment that had replaced the worry lines around her eyes. "Sarah would be so proud of the young men they're becoming." The boys had thrived in Oregon. Tommy had joined the school chess club and made friends easily, while Michael was slowly coming out of his shell with the help of a patient therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. They still had nightmares sometimes, and there were days when the weight of their early experiences showed in their quiet moments. But they were healing, and more importantly, they were together. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman had become a regular visitor, helping David understand the medical choices Sarah had made and working with the boys to process their complex feelings about their birth mother. She'd also connected them with other families who had been affected by trafficking networks, creating a support system that extended far beyond blood relations. "The boys want to do something special for Sarah's birthday next month," Margaret said, interrupting David's thoughts. "They asked if we could visit her grave and tell her about their new life here." David nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of grief and gratitude that came whenever Sarah was mentioned. "I think she'd like that. She'd want to know they were happy." "David," Margaret's voice grew serious, "there's something Thomas and I have been wanting to discuss with you. About the boy's future." David felt a familiar spike of anxiety. Even though the immediate danger was over, he never quite stopped waiting for the next crisis, the next threat to his family's safety. "We want to adopt them," Margaret continued gently. "Not to take them away from you, you're their father and always will be. But to make it official, legal. To give them the security of knowing they have grandparents who will always be there for them, no matter what happens." The suggestion caught David off guard, but as he thought about it, he realized it made perfect sense. The Brennans had financial resources that David could never provide, connections that could open doors for the boys' futures, and most importantly, a love that had been waiting 7 years to express itself. "What do the boys think about it?" "We haven't asked them yet. We wanted to talk to you first." That evening, over Margaret's famous pot roast, David brought up the subject with Tommy and Michael. The boys exchanged one of their wordless twin communications before Tommy spoke for both of them. "Would that mean we could call them Grandma and Grandpa officially?" "It would," David said. "And we'd still be your sons? Forever and always." Michael, who had been quiet during most of the meal, looked up with tears in his eyes. "I never had a real family before. Just people who pretended to care because they had to." "You have a real family now," Margaret said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You have more family than you know what to do with." The legal adoption process took 3 months, but the emotional adoption had happened the moment the boys first saw their grandparents on that video call. By the time the paperwork was finalized, Tommy and Michael had seamlessly integrated into the Brennan family traditions, helping Thomas with his woodworking projects, learning Margaret's secret chocolate chip cookie recipe, and filling the old Victorian house with the sounds of childhood that had been missing for too many years. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, the entire family gathered at her gravestone in Portland's peaceful Riverside Cemetery. The boys had written letters to their mother, telling her about their new school, their friends, and the grandmother who made the best pancakes in Oregon. "We found each other, Mommy," Michael read from his letter. "Just like you wanted us to. And we're safe now. And we know you loved us enough to make hard choices so we could be happy. We miss you," Tommy added, "but we understand why you did what you did. And we promise to take care of each other forever, just like brothers should." As they walked back to the car, Thomas fell into step beside David. "You know, Sarah called me once, about 3 years ago. She said she had children, but she couldn't tell me more because it wasn't safe. I always wondered what she meant. She was protecting all of you," David said. "Right until the end. She saved those boys twice," Thomas observed. "Once when she gave them life, and again when she gathered the evidence that finally brought down their captors. Not many people get the chance to be a hero twice." That night, as David tucked the boys into their beds in the room they shared at the top of the Brennan house, he realized that their story had finally reached its true beginning. Everything that had come before, the separation, the danger, the lies and secrets, had been prologue to this moment when two brothers could fall asleep safe in the knowledge that they would wake up together. "Dad?" Michael's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, son? Do you think Mom can see us now? Do you think she knows we made it?" David looked out the window at the Oregon stars, brighter and more numerous than they'd ever been in the city, and thought about a young woman who had sacrificed everything to give her sons a chance at the life they were now living. "I think she knows," he said. "And I think she's proud of the men you're becoming." As he turned off the light and headed downstairs to join Margaret and Thomas for their nightly cup of tea, David reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A chance encounter on a street corner had unraveled 7 years of secrets and lies, but it had also revealed the depth of love that one mother could have for her children. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, and new opportunities for Tommy and Michael to discover who they were meant to be. But tonight, they were simply two brothers who had found their way home to a family that had been waiting their entire lives to love them. The circle was finally complete. 5 years had passed since that fateful encounter on Fifth Avenue, and the Mitchell-Brennan household in Portland buzzed with the controlled chaos of two 12-year-old boys preparing for the most important day of their young lives. Tommy adjusted his tie for the 100th time while Michael practiced his speech in front of the bedroom mirror, both of them wearing matching navy suits that Margaret had insisted on buying for the occasion. Today was the day they would speak at the National Conference on Child Protection, sharing their story with legislators, social workers, and law enforcement officials from across the country. At 12 years old, they had become the youngest keynote speakers in the conference's history, but more importantly, they had become voices for the hundreds of children who couldn't speak for themselves. "You ready for this, brother?" Tommy asked, using the nickname that had become second nature over the past 5 years. "Ready as I'll ever be," Michael replied, though David could see the nervousness in his eyes, the same eyes that had looked up at him from that cardboard doorway so many years ago. David stood in the doorway watching his sons, marveling at the young men they were becoming. Tommy had grown into his role as the protective older twin, always watching out for Michael while pursuing his passion for chess and mathematics. Michael, once silent and fearful, had discovered a gift for writing and speaking that amazed everyone who knew him. Both boys carried themselves with a quiet confidence that spoke of healing and hope. "Your mom would be so proud," David said, stepping into the room to help with their ties. "We know, Dad," Michael said softly. "We feel her with us, especially today." The ride to the Portland Convention Center was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts. Margaret and Thomas sat in the front seat, their hands intertwined in the way of couples who had weathered storms together. In the back, David found himself thinking about all the moments that had led to this day, the fear, the danger, the gradual healing, and the slow building of trust that had transformed their broken family into something stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. The convention center was packed with over 3,000 attendees, but when Tommy and Michael took the stage, the vast auditorium fell silent. These two boys, who had survived separation, trafficking, and trauma, commanded attention not through drama or theatrics, but through the simple power of truth. Tommy spoke first, his voice clear and strong as he told their story from the beginning, the chance encounter, the recognition, the dangerous journey that had brought them back together. He spoke about the fear of not knowing if they would survive, but also about the courage they had found in each other. "When I first saw my brother on that street corner," Tommy said, his words carrying to every corner of the auditorium, "I wasn't just looking at another boy who looked like me. I was looking at a piece of myself that I didn't even know was missing. We had been apart for 7 years, but in that moment, it was like no time had passed at all." Then Michael stepped forward, and David held his breath. His younger son had always been the more sensitive of the twins, the one who carried the deeper scars from his years in the system. But when Michael began to speak, his voice was steady and filled with a wisdom that seemed beyond his 12 years. "People ask us how we survived what happened to us," Michael said. "They want to know how we got through the fear, the separation, the uncertainty of never knowing if we were safe. The answer is simple: we never stopped believing that we belonged together. Even when we didn't know each other existed, even when we were scared and alone, something inside us knew that we were part of something bigger than ourselves." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience, police officers with tears in their eyes, social workers nodding in recognition, legislators taking careful notes. "Our birth mother made an impossible choice," Michael continued. "She thought she was protecting us by keeping us apart, but what she really did was teach us that love sometimes means sacrificing everything for the people you care about. Our father taught us that fighting for your family is always worth it, even when the odds seem impossible. Our grandparents taught us that it's never too late to find your way home." Tommy rejoined his brother at the podium, and they stood together as they had learned to do everything, side by side, supporting each other. "But the most important thing we learned," Tommy said, "is that family isn't just about who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up when you need them. It's about who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself. It's about who believes in you even when you've lost faith in yourself. There are children out there right now," Michael added, "who are scared and alone, who think nobody cares about them, who believe they'll never find their way home. We want them to know that they're wrong. There are people fighting for them, people who won't give up. People who understand that every child deserves to be safe and loved and protected." The applause that followed was thunderous, but David barely heard it. He was watching his sons, these two remarkable young men who had taken their pain and transformed it into purpose, who had turned their trauma into a tool for helping others. After the conference, the family gathered for dinner at their favorite restaurant overlooking the Columbia River. As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret raised her glass of sparkling cider. "To Sarah," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "who loved her boys enough to make the hardest choices imaginable." "To Sarah?" the family echoed, and for a moment David could almost feel her presence at the table with them. Later that night, as David tucked the boys into their beds, a ritual they still cherished despite being almost too old for it, Michael reached into his nightstand drawer and pulled out the locket that Dr. Hartman had given him years earlier. "Dad, do you think we did the right thing today? Telling everyone our story?" David sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the photograph of Sarah holding both babies in her arms. "I think your mom would say that turning your pain into purpose is the bravest thing anyone can do. We want to keep doing this," Tommy said from his bed across the room. "Talking to people, helping other kids. Maybe when we're older, we can work with organizations that fight trafficking." "Maybe you can," David agreed. "But for now, just focus on being 12-year-old boys who happen to be brothers who happen to be heroes." "We're not heroes, Dad," Michael protested. "We just did what we had to do." "That's exactly what makes you heroes," David replied. As he turned off the lights and headed downstairs, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, he had been a single father struggling to raise one son while grieving the wife he thought he'd known. Tonight, he was part of a family that had been forged in crisis but strengthened by love, trust, and the unbreakable bond between two brothers who had refused to let anything keep them apart. The boys had asked him once if he thought their story had a happy ending. David had told them then that the best stories don't really end, they just begin new chapters. Tonight, as he sat with Margaret and Thomas on the front porch, listening to the sounds of his sons laughing together upstairs, David knew that their story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, new chances for Tommy and Michael to use their voices on behalf of children who needed advocates. But tonight, they were simply a family, imperfect, blended, created by circumstances that nobody would have chosen, but bound together by a love that had proven stronger than secrets, stronger than danger, and stronger than the forces that had tried to tear them apart. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Somewhere in the city, other families were facing their own challenges, their own fears, their own hopes for a better tomorrow. And somewhere, Sarah's spirit rested peacefully, knowing that her sons were exactly where they belonged, together, safe, loved, and ready to change the world, one story at a time. The promise she had made to them in her heart 7 years ago had finally been fulfilled. Her boys had found their way home to each other, and in doing so, they had become the men she had always dreamed they could be. Heroes not because they had survived, but because they had chosen to transform their survival into service, their pain into purpose, and their love for each other into a force for good in a world that desperately needed it. This was their legacy, their gift to the future, and their promise to every child who was still waiting to be found. The brothers were home, and their real work was just beginning.